Hi everyone. In this video lecture, we'll be discussing the major organs of the digestive system. And in a future video lecture, we'll focus on the actual physiology or the processes of digestion in these organs. The first major organ is your mouth, or what we call the oral cavity. This is the space that contains your tongue, teeth, and gums. And while we're not going to focus on the particulars of the teeth and tongue in this course, I do want to point out your tonsils, of which you have several pairs, because we talked about those with the immune system unit. So, just a reminder, here are your palatine tonsils, here are your pharyngeal tonsils up near the opening of the auditory tube or eustachian tube, and then down at the base of the tongue, you have your lingual tonsil. So, any or all of those immune structures may swell in response to infection. And then something else that we're going to talk about in a little bit when we get to accessory structures in another video lecture of the digestive system are the salivary glands, and they're also going to be located in the oral cavity. That brings us to our pharynx. This is going to be our common passageway for both foods and liquids and air. So we already talked about the pharynx in the respiratory system, and we learned about like the nasopharynx and oropharynx and laryngopharynx. Here in the digestive system, we're mostly interested in the pharynx for two reasons. Number one, it's lined with stratified squamous epithelium, non-keratinized. And that's important to us because the majority of the epithelium for the GI tract is going to be simple columnar. So this is a place where it's different. So we like to point that out. And also the pharynx plays an important role in swallowing, or what we call deglutition. So deglutition, or the process of swallowing, can be divided into three phases. The buccal phase, is our voluntary phase. So you are capable of initiating swallowing, and that means you can also stop swallowing at this point and kind of bring that bolus of food back into your mouth. The tongue plays an important role in both forming the bolus, or like kind of the ball of food, and also in moving that bolus back into the back of the oral cavity so that it can go down into the pharynx. Once the pharyngeal phase kicks in, this is where motor commands coming from centers in the medulla oblongata take over, because they are going to play an important role in closing that epiglottis, because we want that epiglottis to cover the larynx to protect the trachea from food accidentally entering into the trachea and ending up in the lungs. So that's not a voluntary thing. That's something that's part of the autonomic nervous system. And so once that bolus of food gets into the pharyngeal phase, which means it's moved down towards the laryngopharynx region, at that point, you don't have voluntary control, and you're not likely to be able to get that bolus of food back up into your mouth. If you think about like accidentally swallowing a piece of gum, you know what I'm talking about, that there's that moment where there's no getting it back. And then once it passes into the esophagus itself, at that point, peristalsis is going to take over. So we're actually going to use contractions of the inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layers of muscle in the muscular layer to move that bolus of food down into the stomach. And that takes about 9 seconds to do that. So it's not as quick as you might think. And in order to actually enter the stomach, the bolus of food will have to pass through a sphincter that is located at the area where the esophagus joins the stomach, which is the cardiac region of the stomach. So that sphincter has to relax in order for the bolus of food to pass through. Normally, that sphincter would have tension or tone to it, and that keeps gastric juices from flowing up out of the stomach and into the lower esophagus, which we don't want because stomach acids flowing up into the lower portion of the esophagus is gastric reflux, right? That's what heartburn is. It's going to create a very uncomfortable feeling, but also long-term repeat bouts of stomach acids going up into the lower esophagus can change the shape of the cells in the lower esophagus. And that's called Barrett's esophagus. And that can greatly increase your risk of developing cancer in those cells. And esophageal cancer is a tough one. So we would want to try to prevent those initial changes or any further changes if that's been an issue. All of this process of moving a bolus of food down the esophagus can be done upside down and against gravity because that's how good peristalsis is at propelling material through the GI tract. Okay, before we get into some of the other organs of the digestive system, we do need to just remind ourselves about the peritoneal cavity and the mesenteries that support and suspend the structures or organs of the digestive system. So just a reminder that the peritoneal cavity is the space between the visceral and parietal peritoneum. You learned about that in AP1 lab. So remember the visceral layer is the layer that is adjacent. It's part of the serosa that is on the actual organ versus the parietal layer, which is typically on the sort of the outside wall, if you will. But what we see in the peritoneal cavity is that the serosa, the visceral and parietal layers, often come together because there is no organ in between them. So for example, if you look like at this piece right here or these pieces right here, we have both the parietal and visceral layer together, and that's where we call it a mesentery. And so the mesentery is connective tissue formed from the visceral and parietal layers of the serosa that help suspend the digestive organs in the peritoneal cavity. And that's actually, number one, that's really important because it prevents them with all the movement that happens here. It prevents those, like the small intestine and the bowel from tying themselves up in knots and potentially cutting off their own blood supply. So that mesentery serves that role. It's also going to provide a pathway for blood vessels and nerves to travel to and supply the digestive organs. Blood vessels and nerves can't just like float through empty space. They need some kind of tissue to travel through. Another important piece of the mesentery is this area right here where you see this fold of the mesentery. This is called the greater omentum. It is where we store a lot of excess lipid. So this is a pretty good energy reserve right here. It's what we call visceral fat. And this is a place where, we would like to have an amount that provides us with a backup energy supply, but we don't want to have an excessive amount here. When you have excess amounts of visceral fat, it often means that you'll also find visceral fat in other areas like around the heart, and that can make the heart have to work a lot harder, and that can be challenging and create problems there. So that's the greater omentum. And then because we have the greater omentum, I just need to point out the lesser omentum. Not so important for fat storage, but it does suspend the stomach below the liver. And then also important to note that visceral and parietal peritoneum of the serosa doesn't include all of the organs. So some organs are what we call retroperitoneal. They are behind that serosa, and that would include things like the pancreas, a piece of the duodenum, and the last segment of the large intestine or the rectum. So not everything is technically within the peritoneal cavity due to where the anatomical structure of the mesentery. Okay, so that brings us to the stomach. The stomach has 3 layers of muscle. Remember in our sort of model earlier in a previous lecture, we talked about how the GI tract has 2 layers of muscle in the muscular layer, but the stomach is an exception. It's going to have a 3rd layer that kind of runs oblique to the other 2 layers. And that serves a really important purpose because the stomach's job is to sort of really crush and mix food. And so that extra layer of muscle really strengthens the wall of the stomach for that function. Also, the food that enters the stomach is going to be called chyme now, as it turns into sort of a pasty gray material as it gets mixed and partially digested chemically. And we have 4 anatomical regions to the stomach that we need to know about. So I mentioned earlier where the esophagus enters into the stomach is the cardiac region. This is actually located not far from the heart, so that's why it's called heartburn, because it feels a little bit like it's where your heart is. A little bit higher than that is the fundus of the stomach, and then we have the main portion, which is the body. And then where the duodenum begins, this is the pyloric region of the stomach, and there is a sphincter here called the pyloric sphincter. So for food to move from the stomach into the duodenum, the pyloric sphincter will have to be relaxed so that chyme can be moved from the stomach into the duodenum. Also visible in this diagram is that greater omentum that I was just talking about, and you can see the large lipid goblets or droplets here, kind of almost like an apron is how it hangs off the stomach. And then the lesser omentum is between the liver and the stomach and connects the two. And then this little diagram up in here in the corner is just showing us that third layer of muscle. And it's also pointing out that the stomach has a unique anatomical feature called rugae. And these are really just folds in the wall that allow the stomach to expand when food comes into the stomach. So those rugae just are kind of like pleats that allow that stomach to expand to accommodate larger volumes. So our 4 major functions of the stomach are going to include temporary storage of ingested food. The stomach is going to mechanically digest using those 3 layers of muscle to crush and mix the food. The stomach is also going to secrete hydrochloric acid and some other enzymes to begin chemical digestion, and we'll talk more about those in a future video lecture. And then the other thing that's important to note is that the stomach produces intrinsic factor, which is going to be really important for the absorption of B12, which you might remember from earlier units is important for red blood cell production. Here's a practice question if you want to pause the video to read it. And I think the best answer here is that it strengthens the stomach wall and assists in mixing and churning food to form chyme. So I mentioned that intrinsic factor is produced by the stomach. The specific cells that are going to do that are parietal cells. So parietal cells will secrete intrinsic factor and they will produce the components of hydrochloric acid. They don't actually make hydrochloric acid because that would destroy the parietal cells. So instead they make it in 2 parts and secrete those 2 components out into the stomach, and in the stomach the components join together to form active hydrochloric acid. So where do you find parietal cells? Well, here is the little chunk of your stomach showing the 4 layers. And you can see that the stomach has these deep pits, if you will, and these are called, the top portion is the gastric pit and the bottom portion is the gastric gland, because deep down is where the secretion is going to happen. So if we look at that in a blow up version of it, here's the pit portion, which is lined by these simple columnar cells, most of which are going to be mucus producing epithelial cells. That mucus is going to be important for lining the stomach and protecting it from the hydrochloric acid. And then when we get deeper down, we come into the gastric glands, and these gastric glands are filled with 3 kinds of cells, all of which secrete things. We have the parietal cells, which we now know secrete intrinsic factor and the components of hydrochloric acid. In this image, they are kind of these mustardy yellow cells. And then we have G cells, which are these bright yellow cells in this diagram. G cells are enteroendocrine cells, so they are going to secrete hormones. Those hormones are not going to go into the stomach. They're going to be secreted into the blood supply, because that's the whole thing about the endocrine system. It uses the cardiovascular system to move chemical signals around the body. So G cells will produce hormones that will go via blood to target cells in many different locations, both in the digestive system, but also in other places like the brain. And then we also have chief cells, which are these pink cells in these gastric glands, and they are going to produce something called pepsinogen. And when pepsinogen is released into the stomach and exposed to hydrochloric acid, it is converted to pepsin, and that is going to be important for digestion, and we'll talk about that more in a future lecture. Also important to note that newborns will secrete enzymes specific to milk digestion from these gastric glands, but in many people, the gene that produces these enzymes will downregulate or shut off, and so as adults, they may not make those enzymes, and then it makes it very hard for them to digest dairy products, which can lead to like stomach aches and bloating and gas. But then in other groups of people, they keep that enzyme active for their life, for their entire life, and so they don't have any issues with dairy. It evolutionarily probably connects to whether a group's origin included a food source that involved milk. So, for example, like populations that used goat milk or cow's milk or sheep's milk or anything like that, then people that had the gene that stayed on would have an advantage, right? And that would be selected for. Whereas there are places in the world where they don't have milk producing animals, and that wasn't an important part of their diet. And so it wouldn't be something important to have active throughout your whole life, just when you were a baby and being breastfed. So some interesting little things there genetically. All right, that brings us to our small intestine, which has three parts. The first part is the duodenum, right off the stomach, and then chyme will move from the duodenum into the jejunum, and then from the jejunum into the ileum. 90% of nutrient absorption occurs in the small intestine, and probably the bulk of that is in the jejunum. The duodenum's main job is neutralizing the chyme because it's super acidic from having come from the stomach with the hydrochloric acid. So, like I said, a lot of that absorption will take place in the jejunum, and then it moves into the ileum, and from the ileum, it will move into the large intestine. We've got about 20 feet or so, which is about 6 meters of small intestine. We're going to see villi throughout the small intestine, and we will also see circular folds in the intestine. If we take a peek, let me see if I can just make this a little bit bigger. Bring this down. Here we go. So this little diagram is just showing us some of the similarities and differences between the three parts of the small intestine. So they all have the 4 layers, the mucosa, submucosa, the muscular layer, and the serosa, but we do see some differences. So for example, there are circular folds in the duodenum, but not as many as there are in the jejunum. And then in the ileum, we actually see the circular folds start to disappear towards the second half. We're going to see really well-developed villi in both the duodenum and the jejunum, but the villi start to get a little stubby and less interesting in the ileum, which would suggest that there's not as much absorption going on here. But in the ileum, we see Peyer's patches, which you might remember from the immune system. Those are aggravated lymphoid nodules, places where there's lots of lymph cells in the submucosa, versus in the duodenum, where in the submucosa we see lots and lots of duodenal glands that can secrete products that are going to help neutralize that very acidic chyme. So just there are differences between the three parts of the small intestine. This image here is showing you the villi, the circular folds and the villi, both of which increase capacity and surface area of the small intestine. This is an actual micrograph of a villus. You can see all of the goblet cells that are secreting mucin out onto the surface. You can see the brush border of microvilli here that helps increase surface area for absorption as well. And you can see the simple columnar epithelium typical of the digestive tract. And again, this image is just showing you those 4 layers again. And then over here, this is a little flashback to AP1 lab, where you had to learn the names of these different abdominal regions. So this is a good time to remind yourself about the right hypochondriac region, epigastric, and left hypochondriac region, umbilical region in the middle. On either side are the right and left lumbar region. And then along the bottom, we're going to have the hypogastric region in the middle, and on either side, the right and left inguinal. And you want to know which parts of the digestive tract are in each of those regions. So you can see the majority of them are in the bottom six. Your ascending colon here is predominantly in the right lumbar region, whereas the descending is going to be predominantly in the left. That means our transverse would go across all three. We can see the kind of bulk of the jejunum in the umbilical region. We got a lot of ileum there too, as well as in the hypogastric region. Our duodenum is kind of up here in the umbilical and a little bit in the epigastric. So just familiarize yourself with that. I'm not saying that there's going to be lots of questions asking you to, name what digestive organs are in this region. But from a clinical standpoint, you really are going to need to know that. And that's going to be very important when you're palpating a patient. All right, that brings us to the large intestine. It also has three main parts, the cecum, colon, and rectum. The major function of the large intestine is to reabsorb water and not contacting contents, but compacting contents into fecal matter. A few things that do get absorbed in the large intestine are some vitamins, including vitamin K, vitamin B5, and biotin. And those are all very important for metabolic reactions in the body, so we want those. And bacteria play a really important role in making those vitamins accessible and absorbable. So this is another place where the microbiome that we're still learning so much about is probably really important to our health. The major portion of the large intestine, known as the colon, is subdivided, and I've already mentioned these, into the ascending colon, which is the part that fecal matter is moving up, and then the transverse when it moves across, and then the descending when it moves down. The final portion is the sigmoid colon, and the sigmoid colon joins with the rectum, and then the rectum becomes the anal canal. There are no villi in the large intestine because, again, absorption of nutrients isn't the primary role. We have some important absorption that happens, but it's just not like what's going on in the small intestine. But there is a lot of mucus-producing goblet cells because fecal matter is harder and sort of scratchier and drier, and so we really need a lot of lubrication in the large intestine. Something clinical associated with the large intestine are hemorrhoids. These are when veins in the submucosa get distended due to high pressure from like straining to go to the bathroom, or pregnancy puts a lot of pressure on them. And so you get these sort of outpocketings of tissue or distensions. And they can be painful and itchy, but they will often resolve themselves, although really bad hemorrhoids may require surgical intervention. Another clinical situation connected to the large intestine is colon cancer, which has become the third most common cancer and is showing up at a much higher rate among people under 40 than it ever did before. So that's a little bit concerning. Colon cancer is treatable, but only when caught early, and it poses some challenges. So getting tested using something like Cologuard, I think, is recommended after, I can't remember if it's 45 or 50, but Cologuard or a screening colonoscopy is a great way to check that there are no polyps, which might be precancerous. There is definitely a connection between fiber and colon cancer. So Americans in general don't get enough fiber, and that may be leading to some of these increased cases of colon cancer. So getting enough fiber in our diet is important as well. In terms of the anatomy, I wanted to point out some important structures. So where the small intestine, the ileum, joins the colon, this specific region is called the cecum. And then once you move kind of superior, you'll be in the ascending colon. So there is a valve where the small intestine joins into the large intestine at that cecum. And so there has to be some kind of coordination to move chyme from the small intestine into the large intestine. The cecum is also typically where we find the appendix hanging off. It's kind of in a protected area, and it may be that it serves as a reservoir for your gut microbiome, because bacteria that are living in the appendix would be protected from any bout of diarrhea. They wouldn't get flushed out. And so they may serve as a reserve to replenish the digestive tract in that kind of situation. Some other interesting structures. So again, let's just review. Here's the small intestine coming in. This is the cecum. This is the ascending colon, transverse colon going across, descending colon coming down into the sigmoid colon, which is this curved part here. And then we have the rectum and ultimately the anal canal. You can see the really robust blood supply that goes out. This would all be within the mesentery, not just like going through space here. And then you'll notice that there's these like segments to the large intestine. Those segments are called haustra. And then you'll also notice there's like this ropey looking structure. There's actually a couple of them that run, I think there's 3 of them that kind of run down the sides. And that is called the tinea coli. The haustra allow for expansion and contraction of the large intestine, and the tinea coli, we're not 100% sure on what it does, but it may create a tiny little channel that allows gas to move down the large intestine and sort of leak out slowly so that gas doesn't build up in the large intestine. All right, so you can't talk about the large intestine, the sigmoid colon, and the rectum without talking about the defecation reflex, because it has both a autonomic piece and a voluntary piece. So the first thing that initiates the defecation reflex is that fecal matter moves into the rectum, and that's going to cause distension. It's going to expand the rectum, which will stimulate stretch receptors. And those stretch receptors, when stimulated, are going to send messages to 2 places. They are going to send a message to the myenteric plexus in the muscular layer. That's going to be the short reflex. And then it will also send information up to the spinal cord, which will be the long reflex and trigger some autonomics there. Both of these are positive feedback loops, by the way, and I always talk about how I can't come up with positive feedback loop examples other than clotting and labor and delivery. So here's another one. So that short loop is going to initiate peristaltic contractions by targeting the stimulating the myenteric plexus to cause muscle contractions. And then also the signals that go up through the spinal cord are going to create autonomic responses that will move and activate the entire large intestine, which will continue to push more fecal matter towards the rectum, distending it more. And that's that positive feedback loop. So that both of those positive feedback loops, the long and the short reflex, are going to relax the internal anal sphincter, which is step 1 for fecal matter to be evacuated. But the final piece that has to happen is you have to initiate that voluntary relaxation of the external anal sphincter in order for the fecal matter to evacuate out of the rectum. And hopefully that's at an appropriate time. All right, so that's the defecation reflex. There are, in fact, a lot of hormones involved in digestion. And the duodenum kind of has a starring role in this because when food is in the stomach and begins to move into the duodenum, this causes the release of gastrin. And gastrin is really important because it's going to increase acid production in the stomach, but it's also going to stimulate motility throughout the entire GI tract. So we'll activate the whole thing. Once chyme moves into the duodenum, it's going to cause the secretion of GIP, secretin, CCK, VIP, and enterocrinin. So that's a bunch of hormones that are going to be secreted in response to chyme moving into the duodenum. Now, the effects of those are that GIP is going to result in insulin being released from the pancreas to help us grab sugar. We are going to have digestive enzymes released from the pancreas. We're going to have bile secreted from the gallbladder. CCK is going to play a role in relaxing the sphincter that allows bile to flow into the duodenum. We're going to have a dilation of capillaries around the gut because we want as much blood around the gut as possible so that we can absorb all of those nutrients and move them into the blood supply to get to the liver so the liver can, decide what to do with it all. And we're also going to need to release alkaline mucus because we're going to need to neutralize all of that acidic chyme coming in from the stomach. I just wanted to point out that GIP is the one that causes the release of insulin from the pancreas. And so it's a good time to just point out that GIP has a similar effect to GLP-1, which is what you may have heard of as semaglutide. The issue with GLP-1 is that in addition to increasing insulin, it does also reduce appetite. Like it binds to receptors in places in the brain that reduces appetite. And that's what drugs like Wegovy and Ozempic and Mounjaro, they are leveraging that in order to reduce appetite in patients that are taking it and to give them more insulin so that they are dealing with their blood sugar better, and it's not just the sugar isn't just remaining in the blood, which is what we don't want, right? We don't want high blood glucose levels. So another way to think about this is just by visualizing it. So this is exactly what was on the previous slide. So you can see here's food in our stomach, and that is going to trigger the release of gastrin. Gastrin in turn will cause additional production of acid by parietal cells. Remember, red means to stimulate. Gastrin will also stimulate gastric motility, so the stomach will become more active, and then we're going to have it's a positive feedback loop. So the more gastrin there is, the more gastric motility, which leads to more gastrin. So we get this really intensifying mixing waves from the muscular layers of the stomach. As the chyme now moves out of the stomach and into the duodenum, that is going to trigger the release of a whole bunch. So GIP is going to be triggered. That's going to cause the release of insulin from the pancreas so that we can mobilize the rising blood sugar levels and get the sugar into cells. We're going to see secretin and CCK released, which secretin is going to release pancreatic enzymes and buffers, and CCK is going to result in the bile being released from the gallbladder into the duodenum. We're going to see VIP, that is going to dilate. V stands for vascular, so it's going to dilate the intestinal capillaries, again, so we can pick up all these nutrients that we're about to get access to. And then also enterocrinin. This is going to help us upregulate the production of alkaline mucus so that we can neutralize all of that acidic chyme that just came from the stomach. Also, you can see that some of these things, right, because of the enzymes and the bile, that is going to help facilitate nutrient absorption, because what these enzymes and buffers and bile are going to do is help us break down our important macromolecules like proteins, like fats, like carbohydrates, so that we can get them to a size and shape that we can actually absorb. So super important. So this is all of the hormones. We definitely want to know each of these hormones, what causes them to be released, and what their action is. And we'll end with one quick question here. Which of the following major digestive hormones enhances nutrient absorption by stimulating dilation of intestinal capillaries? Hopefully you remember that I said V stands for vascular or vasoactive intestinal peptides. So that is going to dilate our capillaries. And then you can think about what GIP does and CCK does and gastrin does as a way to self-assess what you've learned.